Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited about the class, excited about what we're going to be doing for the rest of the month. Let us go to God together and pray. Our dear Father, we're so grateful to be together. We're so grateful to be your children. And dear Father, we are humbled by the atoning sacrifice of your Son Jesus. And dear Father, the shedding of his blood was the most important event in history. And we this morning, as we remember that death, and as we talk about it, and we talk about the events that surround that monumental event, that we appreciate and love you and give you honor that you deserve. Dear Father, we thank you for the blood that was shed. We thank you for that event. And we just thank you for you working throughout history to bring about that monumentous plan. We love you. We just give you praise. We pray with you of all those that are hurting and that are sick and that can't be here this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, I want you to turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 2. And we're going to read a few verses of Daniel chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 40. And I'd like for someone to take on those verses. If someone would, please.
And the fourth kingdom shall, how far are you going to go?
To 45.
45. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forevermore. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass after this. The dream is true, and its interpretation is true. It's sure.
Yeah, it sure is sure. Because you almost, if you reject the miraculous and you reject prophecy, you literally have to have Daniel being written in the 4th century A.D. Why? Actually, the 5th century A.D. That's when the Roman Empire split. That's when the Roman Empire was divided between really the East and the West. The Western Roman Empire, Rome fell in about 430. And then you have the Eastern Roman Empire that exists for another 1,000 years. So, of course, modern day scholarship will put Daniel having been written in the interbiblical period because of its very lucid and detailed descriptions of the dividing of Alexander's kingdom. I mean, you have very specific detail. So if you read a lot of commentaries, you'll find that most people believe that Daniel was written, in the 2nd century BC. I mean, literally in the interbiblical period, because of how detailed these prophecies are. So which kingdom are we talking about? What's the 4th kingdom? The Roman Empire. And it's in the days of those kings, what will happen? Well, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will do what?
Set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed.
All right, so it's during the Roman Empire that we have the establishment of the church, right? And it's during this setting that Rome is predicted to be a powerful force, but one that has weaknesses. And we can see those weaknesses throughout its history and its ultimate collapse in 430. And then, of course, it's hanging on for survival until finally, in the 1450s, the Muslims take over Constantinople. So you see it, you see exactly as it's described here. But what's most important for us is that this lays out the setting for when the kingdom that would never be destroyed would come about. Okay, all right. So Rome comes on the scene in our, at least from our context, interbiblically, in about what time period?
63.
Yes, 63 BC, we find Pompey coming in and of course, kind of mitigating the end of a dispute between these two men, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus. And ultimately, you see that they're going to intervene. They're going to kick Aristobulus out, and they're going to basically kind of begin to govern control over Judea. Now, with control over the area, of course, they certainly allowed the Jews, as they did with both nations they conquered, to rule themselves to some extent. But Judea would prove to be a hard place to self-govern, to allow self-governing, because these were people that were constantly kicking off the yoke of the kingdom governing them. And so it's within this context that we have, of course, Judea under Roman rule. Because of the difficulties of this people, Rome has had to put governors in place. They had to put these guys in place. And we know some of the names of them. Who can name some names of the procurators that Rome put in place to govern these peoples who were notoriously difficult to govern? Name some of them. Pilate. Another one? Well, Herod wasn't a procurator. He was king of the Jews. He was more of a king, or he was kind of a puppet to Rome, but he wasn't a governor. Who else do we know who was a governor who followed a little bit after Pilate? Felix, and who's another? Both mentioned in Acts and the Festus, yeah. So we have the Bible give for us 3 governors' names that ruled in Judea. And these guys were notoriously corrupt. Now the one governor who has historically been at least not vilified as much as the others is Festus. I mean, they said he was a very just ruler, but Pilate was corrupt. Felix was corrupt. And some of the other ones were very corrupt. And in fact, if you have not had a chance to look at your packet for this section, there's some information here that I'm just going to point out to you. It talks about the Roman political system, the prefect, the legate. We'll kind of cover some of this a little bit later, but it's starting on page 35. And it's very helpful, I think, to review some of that. And then just looking historically a little bit some of the other governors that were in play. But the governors were so corrupt that over a period of time, they just engendered such hatred from the Jews that ultimately would lead to the rebellion in about 66 AD. And of course, that's when you have the first Jewish revolt. And they literally begin to fight against the Romans that would end in AD 70, of course, with the destruction of Jerusalem. But again, the revolt of the Jews in AD 66 to AD 70 did not come out, it just didn't come about as a result of nothing. It came about as the result of just increasing cruelty and lack of justice in the Roman system. Just keep in mind that Judea was really far away from Rome. In fact, the story of how Pilate was installed as procurator is very interesting. So, which emperor was in rule when Pilate was given his procuratorship? same emperor that was emperor during the time of Jesus. Tiberius. So Tiberius had a very trusted lieutenant that gained some prominence. His name was Sejanus. And many of you maybe historically remember that name. Sejanus was actually friends with Pilate and goes to Tiberius and recommends Pilate for this position. Now remember, Pilate's not, he's not from Judea. I mean, these guys that are governing in Judea, where are they from? They're not locals. I mean, they're from Rome. And they are positioned there almost, like what we have today, in ambassadors. I mean, they're appointed. They're typically paid well. They live the life of luxury. And hopefully you get positioned in a good place. This was not a good place. It's kind of like if you're in the military, you get a choice to be sent to Lucerne, Switzerland, or you get to be sent to Afghanistan. Which one do you want? These guys were. So Sejanus, during the rule of Tiberius, was accused of betrayal against Tiberius and is killed. And so it put Pilate on very thin ice. And ultimately, Pilate, does anyone know what happens to Pilate? There's a very specific event that's recorded by Josephus where there was a huge gathering in Mount Gerizim by some Samaritans. And there was one who said, it was kind of a rumor that someone had proclaimed that they had found some of the original writings of Moses and that they were going to be revealed on Mount Gerizim. So thousands upon thousands of Samaritans. Well, the cavalry of Pilate met them and slaughtered many of them. And the word got out about this event, and it led back, of course, to Rome, and Rome yanks Pilate out. And he is brought back to Rome, and again, Caligula is actually emperor at that time. Caligula rules after Tiberius. And Pilate is said to have been told to commit suicide. And so, and of course, remember I mentioned to you that some believe that he was banished to the Switzerland area because there is a mountain that's called Mount Pilate in Switzerland. We've actually, you probably don't remember this, but we've been there. It's called Mount Pilate. I remember asking, why is this place called Mount Pilate? And they said, well, this is one of the places that Pilate has said to have been banished to and committed suicide. So it's very interesting. Either way, most likely he committed suicide, but that's the end of Pilate. But these guys were corrupt. And so, and that leads us to this point in which we arrive at this point in which we have the trial of Jesus. And so as I was preparing for this class, I thought, well, I can give you a very thorough history report on Romans, but I didn't want to do that. So I wanted to kind of bring this into the New Testament era. Many of you may be getting tired of the historical minutia, so let's bring it down into the because we can learn a lot from the trial of Jesus, as far as Roman rule, Roman government, and then the way the Jews were structured and the way that they ruled and governed. And so I'm going to begin this. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts just about where we're at historically, contextually, as we kind of come into the last week of Jesus' life? Remember that Jesus had a very short ministry, and about a third of the Gospels covers what particular time period? The last week of Jesus. I mean, it's a huge percentage of the Gospel accounts that we have recorded this particular event. And just to give you a preview and some sense of the way the apostles are looking at this, the way the writers of the New Testament are looking at this, I think it's really good. Let's turn your Bibles real quickly before we get into this to Matthew chapter 27. And I want to just give you some sense of where we're at as we kind of begin going through this. And I will tell you, there's a lot of misinformation, and I hope to dispel some of that misinformation. So let's look at verse 24 through 26. And someone read verses 24 through 26 of Matthew 27.
When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person, you see to it. And all the people answered and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified.
Okay, so who are all of these and all the people? Who are we talking about? Who is all the people here in this context?
Jews and yeah.
Absolutely, yes. We're talking about Jewish people, right? Okay? But one of the things that we're going to talk about for this presentation, and I won't get through all of these slides today, we'll carry this into Wednesday. One of the questions that is your assignment, that I want you to come back with an answer for, is who killed Jesus? You know, this is a very hot button issue. And I challenge you to Google that question. I did. It was fascinating to find out, because when you Google something and you look at the first 100 responses or first 100 listings, you get a consensus of where people's heads are, don't you? But you can kind of get an idea where people's heads are. Well, the first at least 100 responses to that question is a complete acquittal of the Jews. 100% acquittal. The Jews have nothing whatsoever to do with the death of Jesus. My question is that true? If you say that today, you will most certainly be put into the context of someone who's anti-Semitic. And if you say the Jews killed Jesus, you're an anti-Semite. No question about it. You're prejudiced. But what does the Bible say? Well, what does this passage say? The interesting thing that I want you to think about here in this passage, and I wanted to start here because I wanted you to again, look through the eyes of these apostles. You know, John is going to be an eyewitness here to a lot of these events. Matthew is recording this particular event in clarity. But what's key here is that the Jews, in essence, say, let his blood be on us and our children. Now, if you look at the Greek of that sentence, which I don't have here, but if you read that in Greek, it basically reads almost as if, let his blood cover us and our sons. Now, do you think the Jews had any idea of what they were saying? But ultimately what would happen is that his blood would be on them in the very way that when they worked in the temple and they were sacrificing animals, when they were burning those, they would take the blood and they would pour it either on the base of the altar, they'd pour a little bit on on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, they would take the blood and of course sprinkle it on the cover of the Ark of the Covenant. So think about that. Think about the prophetic and just amazing way and again, the Jews here had no idea what they were saying. What they were saying is, let his blood cover us and let it cover our children. And that's exactly what it did. It's exactly what it did. And I will tell you that when it says, on all the people answer, his blood be on us and our children, folks, we are children. We are those children. We are grafted in, but we are those children. Isn't that an amazing thing that in an unintentional way, these Jews prophetically state the obvious of what's happening. So in that way, I want us to just begin with the trial of Jesus and just to kind of get a perspective. We talked about 63 AD, Pompey comes in. Rome allowed the Jews to and other conquered peoples to have a measure of self-rule, but this Sanhedrin, and they allowed the Sanhedrin that was made up of chief priests and elders and scribes, and they could rule on religious matters, but they did not have the authority to carry out capital punishment, especially on a Jewish holiday when there's tens of thousands of people in the city. That's the last thing that the Romans wanted in that particular context, especially with Pilate in the city. Remember we talked about where did the governors reside when they were in Judea? Did they live in Jerusalem? They lived in Caesarea Maritima. And so they lived there on the high Jewish holidays when there was lots of people, there. Pilate would go stay in the city where there was, of course, Roman troops. And if there was an event that took place, he would just snap his fingers and his soldiers would come down from the fortress of Antonia. Where did the fortress of Antonia sit? Literally, it was a balcony right over the Temple Mount. So they could in an instant be down there. So think of that. Think of the cruelty of Pilate, knowing what he did, and Pilate's there in the city. The Jews certainly would not have carried out any capital punishment. And what was the capital punishment that at least according to the Torah, they were able to administer under certain circumstances? Stoning. Yes. And so think about this. Only the Romans had authority to pronounce and enact the capital punishment. And that's why, of course, Mark chapter 14, among other places, the Sanhedrin, after deciding Jesus was worthy of death, they brought him to Pilate. And again, Pilate was the Roman governor. We talked about that. Now, let's talk about this very briefly, because when we talk about the trial of Jesus, many of you have heard talks. Cal, you've probably given many talks. We've talked in classes about the trial of Jesus and its corruptness and all of those things. And so we ask ourselves, well, what rules were the Sanhedrin following when they were conducting a trial? Well, we've mentioned the Mishnah, and I think it's important to bring that out here, because I hope you can remember some of this. Some of it may escape you after this, but in rabbinic Judaism, in other words, in Judaism, especially after the exile, when they did not have the temple, rabbinic Judaism, and especially after the destruction of Jerusalem, specifically, rabbinic Judaism spread, and it was based upon the oral traditions, the oral proceedings that were allegedly given by Moses and passed down through Jewish rabbis over all of those centuries. And when you talk about the Mishnah, it is the oral Torah that was given to Moses, and again, the oral exposition of that. So the traditions of the oral law were expounded each generation from Moses onward, and that was the basis for interpretation. So the interesting thing about the Mishnah, which again kind of governed Judaism to a great extent, was that really nothing was ever connected directly to a scriptural passage. So while most of the discussions in the Mishnah concern the correct way to carry out laws in the Torah, none of them were linked to any scriptural passage. And so this oral law, the Mishnah, again, was really finalized and committed to writing AD 200. What's significant about this? Well, I'll tell you what's significant about this, and that is that this was not really committed in any written form at the time of Jesus' life. The Talmud was not written or really accumulated in any written codified form during the time of Jesus. I'll explain why that's important in just a second. Okay, so we talked about this Mishnah. Again, Moses received the Torah, he passed this down. These are kind of unwritten explanations in Judaism to kind of explain the oral Torah. So Matthew 26:3, we have this statement. Then the chief priest and leaders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus and in some way kill him. Now, who is Caiaphas? He's the high priest. He is a Jew. There is no ambiguity whatsoever about the Jews' involvement in the plot and, of course, the execution of Jesus. I am the least anti-Semitic person, but I read what I read. Now, unfortunately, the Jews would say this is corrupted and it's propaganda, but again, these are eyewitnesses that prove to be reliable on every front. So Mark 14, 1 through 2, and after 2 days, it was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priest and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. So once again, we have, a clear picture here. Matthew 26, 47, a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from where? The chief priests and the elders of the people. Now that the betrayers arranged to signal with them, the one I kiss is the man, arrest him. Again, a clear picture of what's happening. So we've kind of talked about this before, but John gives us some very interesting insight into the events that take place, because John is in some way connected or related to someone in the household of the high priest. Likely someone in the household of Caiaphas, but either way, it may have, we don't know exactly what that connection is. There have been some who have hypothesized things, but he gives us really unique insight that the other gospel writers do not give us. They lead him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Why is Annas involved here, and what insight does that give us on really kind of how Rome was involved in the affairs of Jews? Why did they bring him to Caiaphas first? Annas first. Well, so in the eyes of the Jews, Annas was still high priest. Caiaphas was appointed by Rome. So even though he was the son-in-law of Annas, Rome did not want Annas to be high priest. We don't know why, but Rome appoints Caiaphas as high priest. When you were high priest, you don't really ever lose that position. So in the mind of the very conservative Jews, in the mind of the Sanhedrin, who was the guy that yielded power, at least among the Jews? It was the old man.
How do you feel about Caiaphas?
It was his son-in-law, so he had to...
You got a son-in-law.
Well, I think... that's very good. He had to like him, I guess. Here's the thing. Annas yielded power. And we don't know much about him, but he yielded a lot of power here. And so, but according to the Jews, he was the guy. And how much Caiaphas, Caiaphas had some power, but I would tell you he was probably under at least the authority in some way of his father-in-law. It's very interesting. So the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Annas sent him bound to his son-in-law, Caiaphas. Why did he do that? Why didn't he just execute judgment there? Well, I'm sorry? Go ahead.
Have the authority to, with Rome there.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, he knew that he couldn't send him to Pilate. And because, again, he wasn't Rome's guy. Caiaphas was Rome's guy. Now, what was their intent from the very beginning here? What's their intent? Their intent's to stone him. I mean, don't forget that. I mean, the Jews were not, the last thing in their mind at this stage in this trial, this mockery of trial, was crucifixion. The last thing in their mind was crucifixion. And, we talked about the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen. What if, by some bizarre chance, Jesus had gained Roman citizenship? How would that have changed history?
Could he have been crucified?
He absolutely could not have been crucified. That wouldn't have even been an option. Think about that. And how important is crucifixion in the whole setting of prophecy here? I mean, how many prophecies literally center around the cross. Dozens, probably. Some of which, the fact he was pierced for our transgression. In what way would stoning involve a piercing? There are allusions to wood. There are allusions to he was pierced. There's allusions to being crushed. There's allusions to a lot of things surrounding the cross that are important. By his stripes we are healed. Again, whatever would happen to Jesus would involve in some way him receiving stripes or the opening of his flesh in some way. Again, that would not be a stoning by any stretch. So from the very beginning, God's intent, God's plan was for Rome to be involved. Does everyone understand that? Prophecy could not have been fulfilled if Rome was not involved. Everybody follow that? Because it's only through Rome that a crucifixion would happen. Right? Okay, that's very important. If Rome's not there, there's no crucifixion. He would have been stoned, like Stephen. And so it's very important that these events take place. Yes, sir.
Are any other nations at all that practice crucifixion? The Persians.
Well, they got it from the Persians. The Persians were the ones who invented some form of crucifixion. Even going back to the death of Haman. I don't know if any of you have remembered that. If any of you had in your mindset of Haman being hung by a rope, I mean, folks, that's an anachronism. He was not hung on a gallows. He was put on a stick. Just go back. Sorry?
Isn't that what Alexander did to?
Alexander actually did that. He passed that along. He evidently crucified many of the people of Tyre along the beach. Stuck him in the ground. Now keep in mind that again the Persians, if you look at the Assyrians and the Lakish reliefs, if you've ever been to the British Museum or been to any of the museums, you see these massive reliefs of the Assyrians conquering Lachish. And again, Lachish was a fortified city outside of Jerusalem. And it's where they built a ramp up to the city, and they brought these siege towers up. And what you see on this relief are Jews literally being stuck through with pikes. Okay, so that's going back to the Assyrians. The Persians are going to come later. They kind of refine that to involve a longer period of time of which there's torture involved. In other words, they wanted to prolong the life of the person. Now, the Persians, of course, were pretty crude. The Romans come along. The Romans, guess what they know? They know human anatomy. And knowing human anatomy, they know where to put the nails. They know how to prolong the process. Do you know how many, throughout history, this is an archaeological note, just a footnote. Do you know how many people in history were crucified? Probably tens of thousands, if not a million people. I mean, if you've ever read the stories of Spartacus, the slave rebellion that took place, all of those men were crucified. I mean, there were probably millions of it. Do you know how many remains of men that we have archaeologically of crucifixion? 2. One is in the Jerusalem Museum, and it's a fragment of a calcaneus bone, a heel bone, with a nail through it. And then there's one other one that's in Turkey. That's the only 2. Why is that? Why do we not have the remains of at least some of those that were crucified? Because they were left up to be eaten and devoured by the birds. They were left up for months. And then when they were taken down, they were either burned or buried in such a way where they, of course, there's not anything left of them. They weren't put in sepulchres. The one case in which we have a real picture of that, the one that's actually in the Israeli museum with the nail going through the heel, was one that actually was put in and interred in a sepulcher. But the point being, the Romans perfected the art of crucifixion. It was an art. And at some point, maybe we can talk about this. It's been a while since, I think it's been maybe a few years, I gave it, before you were here, you've probably given a talk on the medicine, the medical component of the crucifixion of Jesus. But the Romans knew where to put the nails in the wrist. And where did they put it? How many of you have ever had carpal tunnel syndrome? Raise your hand. Okay. You know what nerve was being aggravated with your carpal tunnel? The median nerve. That's right where they put the nail. And where did they put it in the foot? Again, there's some debate. There's some that were actually, their feet were like this, and they went through the nails. The nails went through the heel bones into the wood. Some, of course, believe that they went through the front of the foot. It's my contention that in Jesus' case, his feet were crossed. They went right through the Lisfranc joint in such a way where the bones weren't broken. There's lots of interesting. You're getting me off on a tangent. I'm sorry. I can talk about this all day long, but so just to go to your point, yes, Rome perfected the art of crucifixion, and they perfected it in a way where it produced more agony for a longer period of time. And it was usually not the intent for the bodies to be taken down, but to stand there and become skeletons and become basically, bird feed. And why was that? That's a good point. It's a deterrent, right? Why was Jesus' body taken down? Why was he put in? Well, it was Sabbath. Yeah, it was Sabbath. And it was what could a Jew, now again, just what could Jews not do around a dead person, you would be corrupted if you even came in the vicinity of a dead person. So the last thing you wanted on a Sabbath, which was connected to a Passover, was to have a corpse right on a major thoroughfare into the city. So they took the body down. And again, most cases the body would have been kept up. Okay. All right, we chased a rabbit. I'm sorry about that. So Annas sends him to Caiaphas, and then we have the Sanhedrin worked out so many limitations and hedges its procedures that it was practically impossible to convict a person, so an innocent person. So when you read the Mishnah and the Talmud, which is the only written documents we have of how the Sanhedrin operated, it was very hard to convict a person. I mean, the structure is very much like ours in that you had to really have substantial evidence that was clear to convict someone of a crime. The problem is that in all of these references that I have on the bottom, it's referencing something that wasn't in written form for another 150 years after Jesus. So, many of you probably heard, well, the Sanhedrin broke this law, they broke this law, they broke this law. And yes, they did. They were corrupt. But what I want you to be mindful of is that when we have little citations at the bottom of the rule they broke, those rules weren't published until 200 AD. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that they probably existed in some oral way, but again, it wasn't codified. So it was improper, really, for any trial to take place in the middle of the night and on a holiday. And again, you see the referencing to the Talmud. Trials can only take place during the day, never on the Sabbath or on a holiday. And again, that's exactly what happens here. And again, this very night. So the temple kept Passover was observed late in the afternoon. Now, there was kind of two Passovers. Two Passovers kind of developed over time. Initially, it was intended to take place in the home. Where was the first Passover conducted? In the home. Well, over a period of time, with the predominance of the focus of the temple, they kind of drew away the Passover from the home and made the focus the temple. It's interesting to note that Jesus regarded the most important Passover as one that took place in a home and not around the temple. When Jesus celebrates Passover, it's not, I mean, of course, he's in the city of Jerusalem somewhere, but it's not, he's not celebrating it as did the Sanhedrin and many of the high officials of the Jews around the temple. He did it the way it was intended, and that was in the home. And so, again, just a kind of a side note there. So we're at Caiaphas's palace, and when we go to Jerusalem, we go to a site that has been traditionally linked to the palace of Caiaphas. That has, of course, was converted into a church. Anything related to any biblical character is now a church in Jerusalem, right? Everywhere you go. And the name of the church that is the presumed site of the Caiaphas Palace is named what? You were there too, I think, Ron. Do you remember the name of this? In fact, I gave it earlier, this class. The Church of, it's in Latin. It's a Latin word, Gallicantu. You might know what Gallicantu means? The cock's crow. That's what that Latin word means. Because at this site is where Peter heard the cock crow 3 times. So the site, the church that stands where Caiaphas Palace likely was, is called the Church of Galilee, the Church of the Cock's Crow. It's an amazing site. If you guys remember that, we went down into there's like a dungeon area there that is pretty ancient. We don't know whether that's the site where Jesus was held, but you go down to this underground place where there clearly was carved out of stone. It was a place of holding. And again, when you go down there, you're below the church. The acoustics are pretty amazing, and we always sing down there. We always sing a hymn in this place where Jesus was likely held and arrested. And of course, he had to at some point be arraigned, waiting for the morning time. So Jesus is, what takes place in Caiaphas Palace, he's there. We know all the events that surround that event. But after those things that have happened, they bring false witnesses in. They bring in evidence of witnesses, the prosecutors, and of course they lay hold of Jesus, led him away to Caiaphas, high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled at the high priest's palace. And I'm not moving. Sorry. And they bring false witnesses. So 2 witnesses were indispensable. Without 2 witnesses, no one could be convicted, even if they had confessed. The entire responsibility fell upon these witnesses. We'll continue this discussion, but I want you to come back. I'm going to ask you at the beginning of class on Wednesday, who killed Jesus? And I'm going to bet that maybe one of you, if you think you know the answer, I'm anxious to see if any of you know the correct answer. And I'm going to give you a hint, it's not obvious. Okay? All right. See you Wednesday.